Hello, good day to all. My name is Vrhovec, and I'm going to present some lessons that we learned by studying papers in top cybersecurity publications. In our study, we focused on citations. Even though citations may not be the best indicator of paper quality, they are still used as one of the key indicators of our academic performance in many universities around Europe and also around the world. So the key question that we try to answer is how to attract such citations. And what we already know is that it is good to publish papers in top-tier publication venues. But what we don't know yet is if there are perhaps some paper characteristics that can affect the number of attracted citations. To get a better overview over our study, let's take a look at our hypothesis. So the first hypothesis is about a discussion that's been going on in computer science for quite a while now, and this is whether the top conferences like ACM, CCS, and Usenix in the cybersecurity domain are actually better venues than top journals like IEEE Transactions on Information Forensics and Security or Computer Science Security or similar. The remaining hypotheses are dealing with the paper characteristics. And here we try to see whether there's any differences for top journals or top conferences. And the first characteristic for hypotheses 2A and 2B is the title length. So we try to figure out whether it's better to have some short, catchy titles, or is it better to have some long, more descriptive titles. Hypotheses 3A and 3B are mirroring the search engines of major bibliographic databases that we are using quite often, like Scopus or Web of Science. These search engines are offering to search through article title, abstract and keywords to find the most relevant papers. And the last set of hypotheses, hypotheses 4A and 4B, are trying to figure out whether the number of references, which is already known to be a very important factor, does in fact also affect the number of citations for top venues. Now let's move to the core of our study. So in our study we wanted to compare top journals versus top conferences. But to do that, we first have to identify them. So which are the top journals and which are the top conferences? We used Google Scholar Metrics, which is one of the few ranking lists who are actually ranking together journals and conferences, and just chose the first 5 journals on the list and the first 5 conferences. Well, to be exact, the first 5 that are also indexed in Web of Science, the bibliographical database. Why? That's because we had to have complete records of all the papers published at these publication venues. We decided to cover a 5-year period from 2015 until 2019 to have enough records to get some meaningful insights into the data. We didn't choose to include 2020 to avoid any issues with the Web of Science database being updated too late or similar, and to give the opportunity for the papers to attract at least some number of citations, because for papers published in 2020 it might be a bit too soon to have some meaningful citations. For our study we developed 2 new metrics for measuring paper characteristics. The first one is the number of main words in the title. Here we are basically introducing a new concept for bibliographic research. We didn't find any other research using it. The main words are essentially those that are capitalized in title case. So here is an example at the bottom of this slide for this paper. What you see in yellow, those are the main words. The second metric is the number of unique main words in title, abstract and keywords combined. And the reasoning behind this is to have the number of words that are meaningful that researchers are typically using during searching in bibliographical databases. And now let's move on to the results of our study. First, let's give an overview of the studied publication venues. So here we have a figure, and in this figure we have an overlay map of the publication venues. What we can see on this figure is that we have essentially three clusters. The first cluster is the general security conferences, which includes USNICS, IEEE SSP, and ACM-CCS. Then we have the second cluster, which is the general security journals, which includes Computers and Security, IEEE TIFFs, and TDSC, and SCN. And we have the third cluster, which is the cryptology centered journals and conferences together. Now, these clusters are based on citations, which means that these venues are citing among themselves a bit more than between other publication venues. In this figure, we can also see that ACM-CCS serves as an integrating point between the general security conferences like USNICS and IEEE SSP and the cryptology-centered conferences like Eurocrypto or the Crypto. What we can also see in this figure is that these citation links between conferences are quite strong, especially when they're compared to the links between conferences and journals and between journals themselves. The final thing that we can see in this figure is that the average citations per paper among different venues are varying quite a lot, from around 5 citations per paper for SCN and DCC journals, up to 25 citations per paper, for example, the conference IEEE SSP or the journal IEEE Transactions in Information, Forensics and Security. And now moving on to the hypothesis testing. So the first hypothesis was about figuring out which papers are more cited, those published in top journals or those in top conferences. And surprisingly, we found out that papers published in top security conferences are more cited than those in top journals. Hypothesis 2A and 2B, dealing with the title length, also offered some interesting surprises. So not many surprises for journals. So the longer the title, the more descriptive, the better. But it's the opposite for the conferences. It seems that shorter conference papers, or perhaps more catchy, look more credible than those that are a bit longer. Moving on, we have no surprises for hypothesis 3A and 3B. So the more unique main words that we have in the title, abstract and keywords of both journal and conference papers, the better. Moving on for hypothesis 4A and 4B, regarding the number of references, the results are very similar. So the more, the better.
Attention check!
Now, what can we make out of these results? What we can already do is answer a few questions, like whether is it enough just to publish in top publications, and we can just say, okay, no, it's not enough. Why is it not enough? Because there's a substantial share of papers in top publications that are very poorly cited. Nevertheless, there seems to be a bit better if we try to publish in conferences, because the share of poorly cited papers in conferences is about 8% lower than those in journals. An important contribution of our paper is that we introduced 2 new metrics that are based on main words. And these 2 new metrics can serve as alternatives to other length-based metrics. The new metrics resemble the searching process of researchers when they are searching for papers in bibliographic databases, which means that the metrics have good theoretical grounding. On the other hand side, we also showed strong associations with average yearly citations, which means they are meaningful. So we also have some empirical evidence that these metrics are important. So if you're doing some research in bibliographics or similar research areas, then you might consider using our new metrics instead of some standard length-based metrics like the number of characters in the title, the number of words in the abstract, or similar. Moving on to the strong conference-to-conference citations that we noticed in figure that was visualizing the top publication venues, opens some important questions like whether there is some kind of inflation of impact, what is causing it for the conferences. And here are a few important points that we can, things that we can point out. So the first thing is that journals can be suppressed for citation stacking. For example, if you have a cartel of journals, 3 or 4 journals that are citing just each other, but not anybody else, and nobody's citing them, their impact factor can get suppressed for a year or 2. So the journals don't get an impact factor. And this is not an issue for the conferences because the bibliographic databases like Web of Science and Scopus simply don't have impact factors for conferences. Now the second point is that this inflation could occur just because of some very generic reviewer suggestion, which is one of the most frequent ones for conferences, which is the references are outdated. So reviewers say, okay, your references are outdated, and the authors usually respond with adding new references. And especially if you want to catch the newest possible, because of the short time to publication times, then the conferences are the obvious solution. And this is also related to the third point on this slide, which is essentially the same thing happens when the authors are trying to show that their research is on the cutting edge, that they are doing some state-of-the-art research. So the reasoning behind it is exactly the same. So because of the shorter time to publication, then you're showing that you are at the cutting edge. Now the fourth point is related to the discussion that's going on in the computer science research area that we mentioned at the beginning of our presentation. So some authors, some researchers in computer science and cybersecurity simply have a preference for conferences. And because they're publishing much more at conferences, perhaps only at conferences, they can also cite their previous works at previous conference editions. So the self-sites can already contribute to the inflation of the impact of conferences, but also they can also prefer research that's been published in conferences instead of those published in journals. And now it's time for some practical advice on how to tailor your paper to the audience. On this slide, we prepared a table that you can use for tailoring your paper after you finish your, let's say, version that's ready for submission. And this table helps you to tweak the title, to tweak the abstract, the keywords, and of course the number of cited references to maximize the potential impact of your paper. And last but not least, we also prepared a sentence for you that you can include in your paper to make sure that the editors or the reviewers, the program committee of the top venue that you're submitting to are sure that your paper is going to be highly cited if it's going to be accepted and published. If you also decide to include a reference to our paper, we're going to be very happy about it. So thanks a lot for watching my presentation. I really hope that you learned something, gonna use something in practice, and it's gonna work. I also hope that we've been a bit provocative in our study, so this is going to start some discussion either at the workshop or later through papers. And I wish you a very nice day, and I guess I'm here open for questions.